But so far in the series, and remember there's 6 webinars in the series. So far in the series, we started life with looking at the business case and looking at the discussions, the arguments about who it is that we'd actually want, what the characteristics would be of the person that we'd want. And we learned how to determine those characteristics, how to specify those characteristics, how to say the sort of person we wanted. And we looked then at, of course, at the very beginning, we looked at the critique on the existing process, this idea of casting out to recruitment agencies. And we looked at why it was that that process was perhaps a little flawed. Not the agencies themselves necessarily, but the process and the way that the process currently, in many companies, I won't say in all companies, in many companies lacks science. Some companies are extremely good, and some companies are very close to what we're talking about here. And we looked also at how we then came through from job design, and ultimately then we popped out at, well, how do we actually find the candidates? And that was last week. So how for today, I want to look at the back end of the process, the interview. Don't want to spend much time on the interview because last week, obviously, we talked about the tools that we would use, and part of the tools that we would use to make the selection is the interview. So I don't want to repeat all of that, but at the same time, I'd like to cover some stuff on the interview because that then effectively grafts off into the offer. And the rest of it, I want to look at the offer that we might make and effectively what you might say landing the catch. And of course, on that note, remembering that last time we actually have, in fact, I think right at the beginning, floated this slide in that it's the analogy is fishing. If we're going to find, if we want to recruit brown trout, then we'd better look in a river that is rich in brown trout, and we better use the right lures for brown trout, and we better use the right gear and the right techniques, rather than what you see here, which is perhaps a coastal inlet where there are no brown trout and we're using the wrong kit. So we've got to match, very much match, what it is we're looking for and where we're going to find them. And that's been the message all the way through, is matching what it is you're looking for. Now, we spent some time last time also, right from the beginning, I suppose, on this model. Now, the whole point of this model is that you would see that you start from describing and you tumble down through the sections, and we've covered effectively describe, characterize, prototype, search, and a little bit of pre-select. Now we use this term pre-select. In a sense, you're not pre-selecting. What you're trying to do is load information into the selection process, and you see a couple of diagrams here from the Preselect tool, from our Preselect tool, and it's showing you just literally what you see, the candidate in blue according to the personality profile, the Big 5 personality profile, and you can see the ideal, and you can see this person's perhaps a little bit more outgoing, a little bit more open to new ideas than perhaps we would find necessary. It's not a bad thing, but we wouldn't necessarily be too enthusiastic about that, because it might mean that in questioning, when we're actually discussing with the person, we find that they're a little bit living in the non-ideal world, and our role perhaps is more practical. So all I'm getting at there is the need to use this type of pre-select, lightweight personality, lightweight psychometrics tool, which gives us inputs to the managers actually doing the selection. It's not that they pass and fail, so that's why pre-select is perhaps a bad name. It's not that they pass or fail, it's that we're looking to select for the best person to environment fit. We're trying to fit the person optimally to the job, and we're providing that data in to the interview in the selection part. So a little point there on this idea of person environment fit, doing a little bit of work to pre-select and load for the managers, loading into the into the interview. And you'll notice there quite critically, quite importantly, that we advocate 2 interviews. We advocate a first interview. I'll come to that specifically, what that's about in a moment. And then a second interview, which is more about selection. So that select box is 2 interviews. Now, it doesn't have to be, it could be an assessment center, and we've mentioned assessment centers in the past. It could be an assessment center, but we advocate typically that you would run through your test results for the pre-select, you'd go into the first interview, and then as you go into the second interview, on the assumption that you're still talking to the candidate, both of you are enthusiastic about one another, then you are going to do some further testing to support and perhaps magnify the tests that have been done at the pre-select stage, and then you're doing a second selection interview. So we would advocate that. And we're also quite clear here that there's this other section which is onboarding. It's getting somebody in the job. Now, when I mention here about first interview, the first interview, we advocate that the first interview is about one thing and one thing only. It's about selling the job. It's not about asking the person, trying to tell whether or not the person is the right person for that job. Although what you are sensing, of course, one of the first things is, and we'll come to this when we come to bias, do you like the person? Fundamentally, does the person like you, and do you like the person? Because at the end, if the candidate doesn't like the job and you somehow don't like the candidate, it's probably not going to go anywhere. But you're not looking for any great intensive questioning. You're trying to say to the candidate, here's the company, it's a great place to work. And of course, not a word of a lie, you're looking at all the truth at that point. And you're remembering that it's a 2-way process, and you're encouraging them to learn about you. So you learn about a little bit about them, that's more to come, and they learn a lot about you, and you want them, by close of the first interview, to be very, very keen to join you in that company. That's earned you the right at that point to give them some, I might say nasty questions, but to probe who they are without any problem. They want the job, and you're then ready to say, fine, if you want the job, we'd like to know more about you. We'd like to give you the tests that we wish to know and administer. It's very difficult to have a single interview that does the job of selling the job in the first, let's say, 15 to 20 minutes, maybe half an hour, maybe a little longer in the interview, and then go on to start asking questions of that person. You don't actually know if they want the job. It may be that after the first interview, once both of you have sat down and thought about it, it's not right to proceed to the second interview. So don't waste your time. Split the thing into 2 interviews. You have the first interview where it's all very relaxed. They're learning about the company, they're learning about you. You're learning a little bit about them, you're understanding, maybe getting some basic questions and corroborating some things, but there's nothing taxing. It's very relaxed at that point. The next thing then we go on to, of course, is the second interview. And Sue covered these, you've seen this slide before, those that have been on before have seen the slide before. We advocate the GMA, the general mental ability, that is the 3 elements of reasoning testing, and you'll see the predictive validity figures there, 0.58. We advocate work sample test, and we'll look in a moment what one of those looks like. Structured interview, rather than, you'll see further down in here, the unstructured interview. It's a structured interview. That means it's got a very key, it matches, in other words, it matches what you need to know in the job. You're not asking questions like, what do you want to be doing in the next 5 years? That doesn't tell you about whether they can do the job. It's not asking something like, what's your greatest achievement? It doesn't tell you anything about the job. It doesn't tell you whether they're going to achieve in your job. So structured interviews very much targeted. So, and the conscientiousness is specifically part of personality, but we also would advocate personality because we're terribly interested in this whole business of person environment fit. And that's where our focus is going to be. Specify the person we want, determine from tests that that person is the person sitting in front of you, or a near match. for the person that's sitting in front of you. If there is then person environment fit, it's likely that that person will perform in the job. And that's the rationale of the whole process. So just a very quick look at the conducting the interview. This is the kind of general things that you would want in the interview. Remember, we're doing 2 interviews, and this is just a general description. So always explain the process, tell them about the firm. You're going to do that in the first interview, so that the second interview, they don't actually need much more information. They might ask questions in the second interview for clarification, but you've already told them an awful lot. Then go on to talk competency. We'll look at the format of the question in a moment. And then you're looking through into the work sample tests. As you come to close the interview, of course, you need to give the candidate time to ask questions, to clarify what they think. You've had a chance then to ask questions of them. They've come to you in the first interview. There should be quite a good understanding of where both parties are at this point. Both parties should know quite a lot about one another, but there should still be a time where you say to the candidate, I'm sure you've got some questions, and the candidate then has got opportunity to clarify. So for even silly things like, how much will I have to use my car and company business, and other things that are maybe have been missed out, but it's bothering them. So they need to feel that they've had that chance to ask questions. If you've done your job right, of course, don't be surprised if they say, no, I've read your website, I've been on the web, I've trawled the web, I found all your press releases, I've read them all, we had the first interview, you've given me the test, I kind of understand where you're at. And of course, you, for your part of the company, as the interviewing manager, should pretty much know where they're at as well. Quite importantly, as you get towards the end, you want some kind of indication that they would offer the role, that they would accept the role. Now, remember, you've already done your homework. You haven't asked them blatant questions like, well, how much money are you earning at the moment? You wouldn't ask that if you were selling in a selling environment. You would determine whether or not you want to do business first. It only comes right at the end. If you go into, if you're discussing, let's say, I can't think, double glazing is a bad example, of course, because that's rather notorious for poor selling practices. But you get to the end and you seem to like everything you've seen. The product seems to meet the need. The candidate, in this case, using that analogy, the candidate is who you want. The candidate sees you as who they want. You don't want to be opening it up and saying, well, how much money are you on then? What you want to have done is done your homework already and found out typically what that person will earn. And you might then, the offer itself will come later. You don't want to be starting to talk about money at that stage. You're interested in, would you accept the role if offered? And you want some kind of idea, an indication. Of course, most candidates would say, yes, of course I would. But you'd get some sense of whether they would or not. So you know where you're at. And of course, the next thing is to say to them, well, we've got 5 other candidates to see. We will be making a decision, and don't hang around about decisions. And at that point, tell them what happens next. And they are then obviously your part company at that point, but you will have said, well, we like what we see. We're very interested. We're minded to make an offer, and we'll be considering that in the next few days. And I'll call you within, let's say, I'll call you in 3 or 4 days. And at that point, both parties know what's going to happen next. They know how positive it is. If you're not interested, of course, you'll be saying, well, we need to think a lot about it, and we'll be seeing our other candidates, so we will let you know. So there's a kind way of saying that you're considering it, but actually no. Just briefly on the questions, this is looking here at marketing competencies, and this is actually more a work sample test. Just coming back into that type of thing, having ended the interview and now drag you back, apologies, but we need to just briefly say, what sort of documentation do the managers sit with? And the answer is a plan of maybe 3 or 4 pages with questions and work sample test exercises of this nature. And you'll see here, this is for marketing competencies. You see the competency required, which is, of course, you already know where that came from, previous work that we've done. And here's the question that you'll ask them. Take a market with which you're familiar, use the flip chart over in the corner, use a flip chart to illustrate market segmentation for that market. So a very clear thing that you're asking them to do. There's a bunch of pens, and while you're working, you're expecting them to be talking to you and describing what it is that's happening. And it says make any assumptions. And here's the crux of the whole affair: scoring. We're going to score 5 marks. Now remember, let's say we've got 100 marks in the whole interview. We got 5 marks for a good segmentation, a good discussion about tools, and good linking to business outcomes. And of course, you don't get 5 marks if that you don't hit all the points. And the key thing is, it says at the top, market segmentation, tools in marketing, performance tracking tools. You're expecting them to hit specific things, and you decide ahead of time what you expect to hear them say, what you expect them to hit. You can go back with questions, of course, you go back with clarification questions, but the idea is that you maybe have, let's say, 6 or 8 of these types of questions, maybe scenario based, it depends on what they are, and you have a score. And that shows you the sort of practicality of sitting down. The 1 or 2 managers that are doing the interviewing have got these. Any other managers that they might go off and see have got their own questions. We see here it's timed at 15 minutes, and we have a name against it. So who's going to ask this and how many people are going to score? And that's the practicality of the scoring system. That so you can remember, of course I haven't shown it here, but actually below this table is space, there's blank space for the interviewer, the questioner, to be asking, to be writing in comments about the candidate. So let's move on very quickly. A comment about unconscious and conscious bias. Just remember that when you are addressing people, you are going through those interviews, remember things like, it's always, someone who looks good is beautiful. It's human nature to actually have a more positive view of them, and you need to be very careful with that. You need to be careful that you make the assumption, of course, it's an engineering role, therefore engineers are men, therefore there's an assumption that a woman turns up for an engineering role, and there's this terrible bias, conscious or unconscious, which might mean that we feel in some way negative about it. We have to remember, in all interviewing, it's about seeking evidence and against requirement. It's not about, do I like this person? Liking is hugely important, and I said that at the first interview. If fundamentally there's something that grates, you've got to investigate why. But nonetheless, you've got to remember that humans can be very biased, and we must seek evidence against the requirement. That way we don't have any problems with these worries that government puts up from time to time about people being able to be taken to tribunals simply because they asked somebody, asked a woman, are you likely to have any children? And didn't ask the men. Things like that. Stick to what you need to know. It's about evidence against requirement. That's the focus of the whole affair. Then you avoid making assumptions that because their previous job had the word manager, therefore they must have been good at managing. There's all sorts of assumptions, and you'll see in the workbook, we just put down a few of those. If you want a definition of those, just Google them, quite well known bias descriptors. So let's just get to the point now where we've built that scenario. And in effect, if we've done all of that right, then the next bit, reeling them in, is easy. If we've got them that they want the job, we've determined they're good for us. We've asked them, are you likely to accept? They've said yes, think it's a great job. Then you're set up to succeed. Now, we're going to then make an offer. Now, many companies, many of you, we talked about agencies, many of you will make offers through agencies. Our view, that's a terrible thing to do because you're using a third party. What you need to do is, the greatest power is to phone up a future employee and say, hi, it's future manager. You came in for an interview. We thought you were great in the interview. We think you'll be good in the job. And we're very interested in making you an offer. Now, be careful at this point. You're not making an offer because a verbal offer is an offer. And if they think they get any end of the stick that that is an offer, then you're on the hook, using the fishing metaphor yet again. You're on the hook. You don't want to be on the hook. You want to be talking about an offer in principle. So you're minded to make an offer, and you need to make at that point a compelling offer. That doesn't mean it's about money. And we could spend quite a long time about the meaning of a compelling offer. It's a lot about what it's like to work with your company, how good it is to work with your company, and how they'll enjoy working there. The job is good. We've discussed job design. The whole culture is good. Oh yes, there's a salary as well. We can't forget that. There's a salary as well. We then come to make the offer. So we're interested in, they say, yes, I'm interested in principle. And if they've got any sense, they'll say, oh, interested in principle. I do like what I'm hearing. Of course, you'll have to talk about money. You'll have to say, we intend to offer a salary of 40,000 or 20,000 or whatever it is. And we expect to offer these benefits. In principle, are you minded to accept if you were to be made an offer like that? Yes, yes, well, I'm very interested. Okay, so now we're clear to make the offer proper. And that offer should comprise a nice letter, very positive letter, not slapping people down with, if you do this, then this will happen, but a very positive letter. A contract, of course, terms and conditions of contract. If you can, a handbook, a staff handbook with procedures, and some recent marketing documentation to show that what you were saying in the interview is backed up by your marketing activity. They'll know that because they'll have been on your website. And closing, of course, with any other documentation that illustrate that it's great to be there. So there's effectively a bundle coming through the post. Now, some companies just ping an email. We'd like to offer you this, salary this, health insurance this, and that's it. That's really not enough to clinch the deal, because you've got to accept that they will be going to somebody else who will be giving them an offer, and that offer will look very good. So yours has to look good. If you're a small company, particularly, it's your way of wowing somebody to have, and we all know what it's like. A pack of information falls through the door, you eagerly rip it open, and wow, it's exactly what you were looking for. Yes, compared to a little email with 3 lines saying we offer you this, and by the way, you'll get your terms and conditions when you join us. No, that's a terrible way to reel somebody in. So reeling them in. Conditional offer, I won't dwell on this lot. They've got to show they've got the right to work in the UK. These are things that you'd ask them for. They would be, the offer you make is conditional upon these. You'd expect some references, but not as a selection device, as a corroboration of information. They might have to go through DBS checks and the likes, but that's specific, and you'll see it says that there. And you may want them to go through a medical exam. So you make sure that your job offer is always conditional, it's always time bound, so that if they sit on it for a month, you automatically rescind it. And that leaves you with the task at that point of them accepting. It's not over. It's not over till they sit in the chair, and even then they can still leave. The key thing in the period from acceptance of the written offer to physically joining is keep in touch. So you must keep in touch with them. Take the initiative. Invite them to any meetings. If there are company meetings once a month, invite them in. They may say, no, can't come, still employed, can't come. Fine. Send them circulars. Send them any information that's coming out, send them marketing information, keep in touch all the time over their notice period until they physically join. So that leaves us then right at the far end of the process, where we've been through selection, we've been through the work sample testing and interview, we've been through the process there of making an offer and the documentation, and most importantly, to reel them in, we've looked at keeping in touch. It can always, the legs can always fall off, but if you run that form of process, the likelihood of the leg falling off is much, much reduced. So back to you, sir.